I'm Christopher Clark, Cambridge historian. I was born in Australia. For Europeans, that's practically the other end of the world. But the European continent and its incredible diversity always fascinated me. Even in the far-off country where I grew up, I was always aware that so much of our world has its roots in Europe. And modern Europe is one of the greatest achievements in human history. I want to share the grand saga of this continent, and in the process, I hope to rediscover its wonders for myself. Europe. The very name conjures up images of change, unrest, and violence. But the continent has also been an incubator of civilization where wonderful things are created. Florence in the early 15th century is one good example. Florence's ascendancy is reflected in the architecture of its cathedral. The city fathers are aiming high. They want an enormous dome to crown this grand building. No one has attempted such a feat since the days of ancient Rome. They plan to build the largest vaulted stone ceiling in the world. This is one of the most distinctive features of this era. Art, religion, politics, and science merged in the great cultural projects of the day. The Medici financed this crowning feat of 15th century engineering not just out of piety, but to celebrate the triumph of their power and that of the entire city of Florence. The Medici family supports numerous artists in this creative environment. One of them would soon become world famous, Michelangelo Buonarroti. Michelangelo creates what is probably the most famous sculpture in the history of art. From a block of the finest Carrara marble, he carves his David. The last time such a monumental marble statue had been sculpted in Italy was over 1,000 years earlier in the days of the Roman Empire. A biblical figure, naked like a Greek boy. It was provocative, to say the least. Other Italian cities are also flourishing. Venice holds trade monopolies for the Mediterranean area. Commercial revenues allow the city to grow into a bustling metropolis. Everything revolves around money. The Venetians are among the first bankers in history. They set up a banco, or a table, where they conduct their business, and they have to make a pledge to the Republic that they will not steal or commit forgery or fraud. The wealth of the Italian city-states fuels the development of European culture. And, as is so often the case, the source of that wealth is competition. In the year 1500, Italy is just as divided as the rest of Europe. City-states compete for power and glory within a very limited geographical area. In Venice, the Doges are the powerful rulers of the Republic. In Florence, the wealthy clan of the Medici are the ones who call the shots. They're among the most important patrons of the great Italian masters. The House of Sforza commissions Leonardo da Vinci to paint The Last Supper. Sandro Botticelli paints his Birth of Venus to order for the Medici family in Florence. And Raphael's School of Athens is created for the Borgias in the Vatican. The largest and most famous work of this era stems from the hands of the Florentine master Michelangelo, commissioned by the papal court in Rome in a bid to assert the papacy's cultural authority in Italy, the ceiling fresco of the Sistine Chapel. This commission required Michelangelo to paint 520 square meters of surface area, all above his head, an incredible feat. He placed full-scale sketches onto the plaster and poked the lines through with nails or spatulas. It took Michelangelo 4 years to complete the ceiling fresco. This is the great era of the image. In this respect, it resembles our own time. But these pictures didn't need a textual gloss. They developed a life of their own. With gay abandon, the artist Michelangelo simply tosses the Old and the New Testament together in a single painting. This fresco by Michelangelo is one of the best-known images in the history of humanity. You can see it just over there in the Sistine Chapel. the finger of the Creator and his human creation almost touch. To depict the relationship between them in this way was not just courageous, it was revolutionary. God and his human creation are depicted here as embodying an equal dignity. What an elevation for humankind. Adam, the first man, confronts us as a confident, autonomous being, and this in a chamber consecrated to the worship of God. Incidentally, Michelangelo himself had absolutely no lack of self-confidence. The papal master of ceremonies, Biagio da Cesena, commented, "It was most disgraceful that in so sacred a place there should have been depicted all those nude figures exposing themselves so shamefully, and that the painting was more suitable for public bathhouses and taverns." Da Cesena had every reason to be upset, among them a personal one, because in the panel entitled The Last Judgment, Michelangelo depicts Da Cesena as Minos, judge of the underworld, being bitten in the genitals by a snake. For his David and the figures in his Sistine Chapel frescoes, Michelangelo derives his measurements from real people. But he wants to do more than just reproduce actual beauty. He strives for perfection, like his role models, the ancient Greek sculptors. They also aspire to achieve perfect proportionality in their lifelike statues. The Greeks were perfectionists. They were sharp observers. The precision of their art bears witness to an obsession with mimesis, the precise imitation of nature, the ripples in a dress, the detail of the human hand. But they also strove towards an ideal. In contrast to modern conceptions, they did not think in terms of standardized sizes. Proportionality was the key. How big or tall someone was mattered little, as long as the rest of their body was in proportion. Their aesthetics were mathematical. The ideal face had to conform to specific ratios. The small penis we see on classical figures symbolized masculine self-control. And for women, a well-formed and voluminous bottom was deemed especially attractive. The golden ratio applied to humans and architecture in equal measure. It's as evident in the Parthenon temple here on the Acropolis as it is in the Venus of Milo, the famous statue of Aphrodite, goddess of beauty, love, and sensual desire. Europe has never abandoned this ideal of beauty. You can trace it like a red thread through the entire history of European art. Michelangelo's era takes its name from this rediscovery of ancient art and its celebration of the naked human form. The Renaissance. Renaissance means rebirth, but what exactly was reborn? In part, it was the cultural heritage of the ancient world, the essence of what had defined Europe at the beginning of our story. The conquest of Constantinople by the Ottomans had triggered a wave of refugees, and among these refugees were scholars who carried with them ancient manuscripts. A wave of enthusiasm for the ancient world rolled across Europe. Scholars from many lands scoured the continent for manuscripts by Greek and Roman authors. Some of these works had quietly spent the Middle Ages secreted in monasteries. Others had come to Spain via the Islamic academies. And now they triggered a profound sea change in culture. Humanist and researcher Poggio Bracciolini also joins in the search.
Come, follow me.
He is determined to find a book from the 1st century before Christ, De Rerum Natura, by the Roman philosopher Lucretius. This book, a didactic summary of Greek Epicurean thought, presents a dynamic analysis of the natural world, completely decoupled from any concept of God.
Maybe here you'll find what you're looking for.
Bracciolini eventually tracks down his quarry in a Benedictine abbey in the German city of Fulda. Lucretius had created a compendium of what we would today describe as natural science. His book comprises no fewer than 7,800 verses, in which he explains the nature of the world and how people can subsist happily within it without the need to fear gods of any kind. The book addresses profound existential questions, and that's why Bracciolini wants to find it. What an interesting and characteristically European synergy between old and new. By shining a fresh light onto the past, one brings into view a new future. Of course, this is only possible because traces of antiquity can still be found all over Europe. Only when you study them more closely, as the men and women of the Renaissance did, does the breathtaking extent of ancient philosophy and knowledge come to light. Knowledge of those hidden forces that hold the world together from inside, as the German poet Goethe would later put it. Writing in Rome 50 years before the birth of Christ, Lucretius described in euphoric terms the fearless, inquisitive spirit of the old Greeks. The Greek philosopher Epicurus, Lucretius wrote, explored with spirit and sense the endless realms of the universe, returned as a victor to teach us what can be and what cannot. Already for Lucretius then, this was a moment of rediscovery, and 1500 years later, Lucretius himself would be rediscovered, and with him the entire intellectual dynamics of ancient knowledge. It was a typically European interplay of old and new. Only through the illumination of the past did a new future become visible. For those caught in the cultural vortex of the Renaissance, this really was a rebirth. And yet the question still remains, how was all this possible? Lucretius's book played a role, of course, but another precondition was necessary, one that has always featured prominently in great cultural transformations: a critical mass of talented people, among whom ideas, including some that had been conceived 1500 years before, could fall on fertile ground and germinate. Renovation in intellectual and economic life, the patriotism of flourishing city-states, and fierce competition for the best tradespeople and artists fueled this tumultuous epoch. Ancient philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle had generated a remarkable fabric of thoughts and arguments, a special kind of mindset. Their reasoning had little to do with sacred scripture. It was founded on the observation of human affairs and the natural world. Men like Archimedes discover that complex phenomena can be accounted for through simple general rules, rules that apply universally in all places and all times without exception. Geometry, invented by the Greeks, sparks a revolution in thinking. Galileo Galilei, the father of modern physics, also follows in the tradition of the Greeks. The universe, that great book, is ever before our eyes, writes Galileo, but the book is written in the language of mathematics. Only through the careful quantification of his observations is Galileo able to discern consistent patterns and to develop his law of falling bodies. This is also the period when the European universities begin their unstoppable rise. Each researcher builds on the work of others across the diverse regions of Europe, creating healthy and exciting competition. Universities like Cambridge lead the way. Once a year, it's possible to experience what a healthy competition between universities looks like at the great boat race between Cambridge and Oxford. It's quite tough, and it's taken very seriously. The two universities regard each other as peer institutions, but they also want to outperform each other. And even today, the race remains a potent symbol of the pursuit of excellence, not just in sport, but in the intellectual arena as well. From the beginning, competition has been one of the driving motors of European history. Life on this continent has been marked by constant rivalry between dynasties, countries, and cities, and soon also between universities and researchers who strove with all their might to discover what held the world together. And here in England, another decisive element came into play: the joy of experimentation, of observing and interpreting the processes at work in the natural world. Italian mathematician Galileo Galilei laid the groundwork, but it's an Englishman who finally identifies and theorizes the mysterious force that brings everything falling to the ground. Isaac Newton, the discoverer of gravity. Was it really the apple that led to Newton's breakthrough? Even today, it seems, centuries after his death, poor Newton can't shake that myth. Here under the walls of Trinity College, there's an apple tree that stems from the original tree from which the apple is supposed to have fallen on Newton's head. In reality, of course, Newton's revolutionary discoveries had less to do with falling apples than with the Bible, which he read every day. Newton owned 30 Bible editions in a variety of languages. That might seem strange to us today, but by then it was anything but. As a scientist, Newton was deeply rooted in the Christian faith and in the conviction that faith and reason do not, and indeed cannot, contradict each other. Why should it not be God who infused objects with gravity? By studying the Bible, Newton also comes to believe that God is not a trinity, but rather a unified force that encompasses the entire world. And this in turn leads him to the idea that time and space are the sensorium of God. Theology becomes physics, and vice versa. But Newton's rejection of the Trinity made him a heretic. For the Church, God was composed of 3 persons. For Newton, there was no fundamental tension between faith and science. They formed a unity. Observation was the highest form of prayer. And so it seems appropriate that he should be buried in Westminster Abbey, arguably the most important church in the Kingdom of Britain. The inscription on his tomb reads, "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night, and God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light." This captures something real about Newton's era, an era in which great achievements were still associated with the fulfillment of God's will. This would soon change, and 200 years later, Charles Darwin, also from Cambridge, would shake and remake the world of knowledge. Here he lies, directly beside Newton. Only over millions of years, Darwin proposed, did life on Earth develop into what it is today. The species as we know them were not created by God, but were rather the result of an evolution, a development. It followed that the high apes were our closest relatives. These were scandalous claims. In Darwin's case, it was not scientific observation as such that rocked the foundations of traditional religion, but the displacement of divine revelation by history. It was Darwin, the natural historian, whose thinking transformed the modern world. Since then, Darwin's theory has been confirmed many times over, even if it has failed to convince those who see in the Bible a literal description of the creation. Since the ancient Greeks, the search for a rational explanation for worldly phenomena and their reduction to simple formulae has been the basis of scientific thought in Europe, and so it remains today. The Polish mathematician and astronomer Nicolaus Copernicus observes that the Earth revolves around the Sun. The Italian Galileo Galilei delivers further arguments to support that claim. The Englishman Isaac Newton discovers gravity, and the German Jew Albert Einstein carries on their work with his theory of relativity. A European relay race through the centuries. Since the days of the ancient Greeks, the search for a simple, comprehensive formula has formed the basis of scientific thought in Europe, and it remains so even today. Tidanthropos, tiduk. What is man? What is he not? And of what stuff is the world made? Ancient Greece was the theatre of an intellectual revolution. There were numerous schools of thought, an archipelago of little academies whose philosophers competed bitterly with one another. Some observed and experimented, others searched for philosophical answers. One Greek thinker who stood out for his curiosity and creativity was Heron. 1400 years before Leonardo da Vinci, this engineer and mathematician was already constructing complex machines, such as a vending apparatus that could dispense both milk and wine, a wind-powered organ, and an early precursor of the steam engine. The philosopher Democritus, hit upon the idea that he could, in theory, keep slicing an apple into ever smaller pieces, as I'm doing just here. Could you simply continue doing this forever? Democritus suspected that the answer was no. He thought that one would eventually arrive at indestructible little spheres that could not be subdivided. He called them atoms, with the Greek word atomos, indivisible. 2,400 years later, we're still pushing at this frontier, and we're doing it at the heart of Europe. And here at the CERN Research Center in Geneva, the search inaugurated by Democritus continues. 13,000 scientists from 85 countries hunt for the smallest particle, demonstrating in the process that the ancient principles still apply. You posit a theory, and then you use experiments to test it. And in this place, we are dealing with no less a matter than the basic principles of our universe. This is fundamental science, driven by curiosity alone. The biggest machine in the world is used to study the smallest particles of matter with the aid of an immense particle accelerator some 27 kilometers in length. A tunnel into the furthest frontiers of our understanding, and within it, the fastest particle accelerator in the world.
One time, actually, we had a film crew in here. They were on the bell or something like that, and they moved out. Camera.
What are you trying to achieve with all this machinery?
I think what we try to reach is to answer fundamental question which mankind ever had. It's the questions, who are we, where do we come from, and where do we go to?
Is there something special about the architecture of public science in Europe that makes this kind of work possible?
I think, yes, Europe is very special. So when CERN was funded in 1954, it was very special that Europeans get together and fund this research. And now, with the European Research Council, this is even more, and it even helps science, fundamental science, even more to do research.
Democritus's apple was a little less expensive. This particle accelerator costs as much as 20 football stadiums and is longer than any Formula One racetrack. Physicists plan to use this machine, the biggest in the world, for just one thing: to find tiny particles. Here in Europe, the door is opening to a new dimension of physics. Partnerships at the European level are nothing new, of course. Galileo Galilei corresponded with his European colleagues, including his young admirer Johannes Kepler, who is particularly fascinated with the moon. And Galileo draws up the very first map of the moon. There's an inscription on this famous Bernini elephant in the center of Rome that says, "Whoever you are, view this monument as a lesson, namely that only a robust spirit can sustain a powerful insight." Which is ironic, because it was just a stone's throw from here, behind these walls, in 1633, that Galileo Galilei was forced before the Inquisition to recant his assertion that the Earth rotated around the sun. He had demonstrated this quite clearly in his Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, a book that until 1825 remained on the Vatican's list of banned texts, although science had of course long proved that indeed the Earth did rotate around the sun and not the other way around. The Renaissance changed Europe and the world in almost every domain, and in the process, entrenched positions of power were often called into question. For a further 300 years, the Roman Church will persist in considering heliocentrism to be a heretical doctrine. The Inquisition forces Galileo to recant his theories, and the Church doesn't admit its mistake until 1992, when Galileo is ultimately vindicated by Pope John Paul II. Galileo's discoveries sparked developments that continue into our modern era. In the 1960s, people landed on the moon for the first time, thanks in part to the expertise of European researchers who developed rocket technology during the Second World War.
9:34 a.m. Apollo 15 lifted from the pad on its way to the moon.
Walking on the moon would have been impossible for Galileo to imagine, and yet he'd already shown how objects would behave in a world without an atmosphere. They all fall at the same rate, as the astronauts of the Apollo 15 mission demonstrate. These days, our knowledge of the universe is growing ever more precise. We've inherited a learning process that began in Europe 500 years ago. During the Renaissance, people turned their attention not only to God and the heavens, but inward to themselves. One of the most inquisitive individuals of this era can be found in Florence. His name is Leonardo da Vinci. He's already renowned for his many talents during his lifetime. He's a pioneer. Sigmund Freud would later say of him, he was like a man who woke too early in the darkness while everyone else was still asleep. Leonardo designs countless devices, diving equipment, submarines, and flying machines. Most of his inventions must have seemed like flights of fancy to his contemporaries, but in fact he was a man far ahead of his time. Not only is Leonardo a painter and an inventor, he's also a trailblazer in modern anatomy. Leonardo refuses to confine himself to superficial observations of the human body. Over the course of his scientific and artistic career, he dissects a total of 30 corpses. Leonardo's investigations yield new and precise insights into the inner workings of the human body, and his exploration of corpses is a boon to more than just science. It also benefits the art world. Like many of the great masters of the age, Leonardo believes that understanding anatomy is an important prerequisite for capturing the human form on canvas. His most famous work is the painting known as the Mona Lisa, which he starts in 1503 and keeps in his workshop until his death in May 1519, with the excuse that it's not finished yet. Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa is still the ultimate icon. When the 19th century critic Walter Pater contemplated this painting, he claimed to see in it the whole of European history: the animalism of Greece, the lust of Rome, the mysticism of the Middle Ages, the return of the pagan world, the sins of the Borgias. She is older than the rocks among which she sits. Like the vampire, she has been dead many times and learned the secrets of the grave. Pater's words, not mine. But if that really were the case, then the Mona Lisa might well be the quintessential embodiment of Europe. And it's probably the most renowned painting the continent has ever produced. Every year, millions of people come to the Louvre in Paris to admire it. Meanwhile, another capital city dedicates itself to providing down-to-earth entertainment for the masses, a tradition that remains alive to this day. In 1599, London witnesses the birth of a public entertainment venue of a new type: the Globe Theatre. In this circular building, the man who might rightly be called Europe's greatest playwright stages his works. There is a unique artistic synthesis between this theatre and the performances themselves. This is where the city's pleasure-oriented denizens find exactly what they're looking for. What counted as entertainment in those days? Public executions, cockfights and bear baiting, or mystery and morality plays with devils, demons and allegorical figures. And then along came a man who drew inspiration from these sources, an uninhibited spirit whose genius turned this turbulent world into a work of art. William Shakespeare's plays drove audiences wild, and it's impossible to explain the richness of his imaginary world without understanding the Babylondon of his era, a sprawling city beside a river teeming with courtiers, merchants, artisans, navvies, prostitutes, beggars, and cut-pursers. In Shakespeare's round globe theatre, everything revolved around the full, vibrant, emotionally charged lives of human beings, and the public stood right in front of the stage. Shakespeare's theatre encompassed the whole of human existence. All the world's a stage, says a character in As You Like It, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. The ancient Greeks invented theatre as a cult for their gods. Their dramas were intended to educate the citizens of the polis. Shakespeare learned from them, of course, but his primary goal was to hold a mirror up to society, to entertain his audiences with a vision of the world they lived in. No other dramatist has had such a profound influence on the evolution of theatre across the world. With almost demonic energy, Shakespeare churns out comedies and tragedies. His works illuminate all the lights and shadows of human existence. His writing gives us a glimpse behind the scenes of power, a world of regicide, incest, and magic. Plays like A Midsummer Night's Dream, As You Like It, Hamlet, Othello, and Romeo and Juliet still move us even after 500 years. Above all, Shakespeare's writing reflects the upheaval and cultural awakening taking place in Europe. His works hold up a mirror to a new age, an age of restlessness in which a process of globalization led by Europe is already in full swing. And the world around London was in flux. Shakespeare was born in 1564, the same year as Galileo Galilei, the man who discovered that the earth was in constant motion, that it revolved around the sun. And Shakespeare too was a transformer. He revolutionized the world of drama and the way stories were told on stage.
A miracle! Here's our own hands against our hearts. Come, I will have thee, but by this light I take thee for pity.
Shakespeare is a courtly entertainer. Queen Elizabeth I is his first patron, and her successor would continue to support Shakespeare's work. Elizabeth I loved the theatre. Before her, it had been the exclusive domain of the nobility. She made it available to everyone. Members of all social classes come together here. On the stage, actors portray peasants, the bourgeoisie, and the nobility, groups that are also represented in the audience. This is a new phenomenon. The new social space of the theatre prefigures the mass entertainment of our own day. Shakespeare was a hard act to follow. But in the following centuries, countless European writers and performers would further refine and expand the spectrum of public entertainment, sharing their own forms of artistic expression with the rest of the world. Berlin's Skladanowsky brothers announced one of the world's first public film screenings on November 1st, 1895. At around the same time, the French Lumière brothers astonished Parisian audiences with their moving pictures. Film begins as a carnival attraction, but this seventh art soon becomes a respected medium, and in the grand Shakespearean tradition, the audience experiences the suspension of disbelief and the rapid alternation of strong emotions. British performer Charlie Chaplin's meteoric rise begins in 1914 with his role as the Tramp. Other European stars like Marlene Dietrich also enjoy international careers. It isn't until after World War II that Europe is relegated to second place in the world of the silver screen, behind Hollywood. But Europeans will continue to play a vital role in Tinseltown's golden era as well. Billy Wilder, born in modern-day Poland. Scotsman Sean Connery. Englishman Cary Grant. Austrian Christoph Waltz. And British Kate Winslet are just a few of Hollywood's legendary Europeans. The film industry creates imagery and role models that everyone knows, and many would like to emulate. Spectacle can be a form of mainstream entertainment, a mirror in which society gazes at itself. but it can also be a tool of power, as it was in the Palace of Versailles. All of this is one enormous stage with opulent scenery and props. This was absolutism under Louis XIV. Refinement was an integral part of the courtly repertoire. Elegance was crucial in everything from architecture to clothing. Louis XIV may be the greatest patron of the arts the world has ever seen. Painting and music flourished under his patronage. Representative and monumental styles were driven to excess in the buildings and gardens of the period. Power, art, and craftsmanship joined hands. The court became a culture machine. This is one of the reasons why even today the very name of France is associated with beauty and aesthetic refinement. Versailles was to become the political theatre of its time. The ambitious men and women who jostled for power here were the players. In 1682, the enormous palace replaced the Louvre in Paris as the seat of government, and from then on the royal court, composed of ministers, civil servants and noble families, lived and worked in Versailles, occupying no fewer than 2,000 rooms, which housed up to 20,000 people in all. Louis XIV managed to concentrate his mightiest subjects in a single location, and that's how he controlled them. The Duke of Saint-Simon describes the principle as follows: "The king loved splendor, lavishness, and abundance in everything. He deliberately encouraged those around him to give in to their desire to emulate him in every possible way. He inculcated his entire court with this desire. You could earn his favor by spending extravagantly on your table, your clothes, your equipage, your household, and your games. Luxury became a matter of honor." One example of this extravagance is the daily ritual of watching the king dine. In this pleasure-oriented era, dining at the court takes on a whole new meaning. No European court is more important in this regard than the court of the Sun King in Versailles. His table manners, it must be said, leave a lot to be desired. A century earlier, the Italian noblewoman Catherine de' Medici had tried to teach the French proper manners and fine dining. These customs had their roots in Italy. The style of the Sun King's court catches on in Europe. The architecture is especially popular. Local rulers, particularly in Germany, do more than just expand their residential cities. They also build new palace complexes with geometrically designed French gardens. In the later 17th century, many European princes looked towards France with admiration and envy. They also imitate French styles of furniture and clothing. A booming luxury industry springs up around the French royal court, an industry where France still leads the way today. French luxury products become a top export in the 17th century. Anything of French origin is considered the height of elegance. The latest creations are presented on little dolls, the forerunner of the mail-order catalogue. And even back then, items were shipped all around Europe. Fashion-conscious Europeans were already enchanted by France in the days of the Sun King. They adored the refined style inspired by the Vanity Fair of Versailles. It found imitators across the continent. French clothing designs, hairstyles, and even the language were copied throughout Europe. And French terms like haute couture, mannequin, and prêt-à-porter are still used in the global fashion industry today. And in the 20th century, geniuses like Coco Chanel and Christian Dior, with their haute couture designs, elevated fashion to an art form. One thing has not changed since the days of the Sun King. Paris is still the undisputed fashion capital of Europe and the world. The city is brimming with artisanal skills and creativity. Perhaps that's why even today, Paris produces the hottest new fashion trends year after year. Further to the east, in Russia, There's still little trace of this flourishing new culture. Only a handful of nobles are even aware of what life is like in other countries. The opportunity to travel has given them a perspective that extends beyond their own backyard. Peter the Great is one of these privileged few. In 1697, he goes on a grand tour, and it's hardly a solo journey. A retinue of no fewer than 300 accompanies him on his trip across Europe. His journey lasts 18 months and takes him to Poland, Prussia, Holland, England, Saxony, and Austria. His goal is to catch up with the Western powers of the European continent. From the Dutch, he learns shipbuilding, and the Prussians teach him the art of cannon manufacture. The English tutor him in finance. Upon his return, the Tsar begins the process of modernizing his country, following the examples set by the European states. And the first thing he does is issue an official decree declaring traditional beards illegal. Peter views them as a symbol of Russia's backwardness. To enforce this ban, he leads by example, and then sends barbers out to shave the masses.
Come in.
There's no escape unless the bearded man acquires an official license for his facial hair. Peter wants to usher in a new era of progress and growth in his backwater empire. He hopes to create a society with Western European standards. He restructures the government, initiates social reforms, promotes education and science. Everything he's seen and learned in the West, he now wants to apply to his own country. Russia also moves closer to Europe in geographical terms, or at least the Russian capital does. The Tsar insists on a capital city with a port and access to the sea, so he turns his back on the traditional capital of Moscow and commissions the construction of St. Petersburg, his window to Europe. You'd never know it by looking at Europe's fourth largest city today, but St. Petersburg got off to a difficult start. The construction site was a swamp, and there wasn't enough stone for building. Peter received hands-on support from Italy, Germany, Holland, and France. Italians, Germans, and Dutchmen entered Russian service and gave the city its characteristically European face. We can still admire their work today. Peter the Great encouraged his people to look to the West. There was something theatrical about the way he forced his Russians to emulate the fashions and customs of Western Europe. The objective was a comprehensive transformation of Russian life, at least among the upper classes. Wealthy Russians imported every product imaginable, and along with those goods came Western European culture and manners. German merchants arrived, as did Dutch and British engineers, Italian architects, and French musicians and theatre companies. They all blended together in typical European fashion. But this demand, delivered from above as it were, that they should align themselves with the West, divided the Russians. We have two fatherlands, Russia and Europe, wrote Dostoevsky, who also relocated to St. Petersburg. On one side was the enlightened, sophisticated West, with its promise, at least, of progress. On the other, Россия, a little backwards perhaps in some respects, but homely, familiar, and in tune with the spirit of the people. A love-hate relationship arose between Russians and the West, a mixture of attraction and distrust that lingers to this day. Russia's autocratic systems also linger today. First came the rule of the Tsars, then the October Revolution of 1917 ultimately put an end to that. And then came communism. With unimaginable brutality, Joseph Stalin implements a dictatorship of the proletariat. And even under Leonid Brezhnev, the party still determines what people can read or listen to. At the same time in Western Europe, the 1960s, mainstream popular entertainment enters a new phase of expansion. England has been a pop culture powerhouse since the 16th century and the days of William Shakespeare's successful plays. 4 young men from Liverpool also follow in that Shakespearean tradition: the Beatles. The Fab Four have sold more than 1 billion records, making them the most successful musicians in European history. When the Beatles came to Australia for the first time, to my hometown of Sydney, I was 4 years old. I wasn't really aware of it at the time, of course, but the sound and style of the Beatles left their mark on my generation. Only later did I become aware of the Rolling Stones. These were the 2 poles between which pop music evolved in the 60s. On the one side, the Beatles, cheerful, nicely dressed, well-behaved. On the other, the Stones, wild, unpredictable, and darkly pessimistic. Love, 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 versus I can't get no satisfaction. On the 26th of June 1966, the Beatles come to Hamburg on their Blitz tour, and the fans go wild with excitement. This event cemented fan culture as an integral part of European society. The concert is seated, and an effort is made to maintain decorum, but it isn't long before everyone goes crazy. The band and the audience have trouble even hearing the music. "150 years before the Beatles, another kind of musical revolution sweeps across Europe, and this time it starts in Austria and Germany. Politically speaking, early 19th century Vienna is rather conservative, but musically it's in the midst of a revolution. While the delegates at the Congress of Vienna in 1815 dance the same waltzes over and over, Beethoven begins work on his 9th and final symphony. Ludwig van Beethoven, a native of Bonn, finds patrons in Vienna who finance his compositions and his livelihood. This monument in Vienna portrays Beethoven as a sort of demigod. The angels symbolize his 9 symphonies. Just as Renaissance Florence had brought forth painters and sculptors, Vienna became an incubator of musical works of transcendent value. The fact that Beethoven is able to finish what would become his most famous work, his 9th symphony, after nearly a decade, is a minor miracle. By this point, Beethoven is almost completely deaf. He can hardly have imagined the extraordinary resonance that his works would have in today's Europe. The Berlin Refugee Choir, where refugees from Syria, Afghanistan and Iraq sing together with Germans, have made Beethoven's Ode to Joy their anthem. Since 1985, Beethoven's Ode to Joy has been the official anthem of the European Union. On Christmas Day 1989, a month after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Beethoven's 9th Symphony was performed in the Konzerthaus on the Gendarmenmarkt under the direction of Leonard Bernstein, but with a slight change to the wording of the final chorus, which now opened not with the word joy, but with freedom, beautiful spark of the gods. It was a turning point in the history of Europe. And many of those who are singing here tonight have better reason than most to know the value of freedom. That's why they came to Europe, where freedom is a basic right. The European anthem is sung around the world in its original language, in Africa, South America, and Japan. This extraordinary piece of music is the soundtrack to the world's vision of Europe today. And today it's more important than ever that Europe unites in recognizing and acting upon its shared responsibilities to the world. Today's leg of my journey begins in Paris with a meeting that might surprise you. Does this lady here look familiar to you? Well, it's no wonder. She's the little Paris sister of Lady Liberty in New York. The French gave the Statue of Liberty to the Americans as a gift, in gratitude, it could be said, for America's role in inspiring the most important turning point in Europe's history. America had broken away from England. The American Declaration of Independence, which the Statue of Liberty holds in her arm, includes the lines, "All men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." In the fledgling United States, it seemed, freedom, equality, and progress reigned. 2 years before the French Revolution, self-determination and the liberty of humankind were written into the American Constitution. It was as if the utopias of enlightened political theory had sprung to life. Pennsylvania, 1777. French nobleman Lafayette is fighting on the side of the American colonists for democracy and human rights, and against the English colonial rulers whom the settlers see as their oppressors. The old order begins to falter in Europe and the rest of the world. The Americans man the barricades in what will become known as the Revolutionary War. In the previous year, the United States of America, as the colonists now call themselves, had declared its independence from England. The Statue of Liberty in New York is still a symbol of freedom and democracy today. It was a gift from the French to the country that helped to spark a revolution in their own country. L'État, c'est moi. I am the state. That's how the kings of France think. The Palace of Versailles, just outside Paris, is a manifestation of absolutism and of the existing European order. Many European monarchs model themselves on French royalty. The monarch holds all executive power. There is no formal separation of powers into executive, judiciary, and legislature. All chains of command converge on one person in one place, Versailles. This is a society of orders with different rights and responsibilities, the clergy, the nobility, and of course the third estate encompassing the rest of society. Those at the top of the pyramid wallow in luxury, while the poor often go hungry. The days of absolutism were numbered. Have the courage to make use of your own reason. With these words, the Königsberg philosopher Immanuel Kant summed up the meaning of enlightenment. And today, in what's sometimes called a post-factual era, his words are more important than ever. Profound discoveries in the field of the natural sciences had already paved the way. With their thinking and their precise reckoning, Galileo, Kepler, and Newton had already transformed human understanding of the world and the universe. When the French philosopher René Descartes declared, "I think, therefore I am," he made the reflecting, questioning consciousness of an individual human being the fulcrum of our knowable existence. In the European salons, often run by high society ladies, the old order is increasingly called into question, especially in France. Thinkers like Rousseau, Diderot, Montesquieu, and Voltaire extol the principles of human equality, tolerance, and the division of powers.
By his nature, man is free. And all his actions must be based on reason. I tell everybody, think for yourself. We ourselves are responsible for what we do, but also for what we don't do.
That's true, my dear Voltaire, but it's also important to set the limits on power. Experience teaches us that any man with power tends to abuse it. That is why the three powers of a state should be separated: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. Freedom can only exist when the powers of the state are separated. Reason would mandate that as well, don't you think?
During the Enlightenment, knowledge is diligently collected and published in the form of encyclopedias. But these are not mere storehouses of knowledge, they are critical and argumentative.
Monsieur Diderot, I'm glad you could make it today. Come with me. Here, I bring you the author of the Encyclopédie that you hold in your hands.
Oh, this here is a declaration of war against the king.
And why is that?
When man starts listening to the voice of reason, he will strangle the last king with the guts of the last priest.
The writing is on the wall. Peasants and commoners are financing the extravagant lifestyle of the royal court. The nobility and clergy are largely exempt from taxation. The argument that this is a natural and God-given state of affairs comes to seem less persuasive. This is a menu from the court at Versailles. 20 courses were served, from jellied lobster and scallops in oyster sauce to morel soufflé and leg of hare. And while the nobles of Versailles reveled and feasted, the people in many parts of the country starved. The world of the court and the world of everybody else drifted apart. This was just one of the reasons why the French monarchy failed to make it through to the end of the 18th century. The fundamental problem was government debt. France has become the most populous country in Europe. 25 million people live here. Food is scarce and prices have spiked.
We want bread. Down with the king. We want bread. Down with the king. We want bread.
In 1788, bad harvests and catastrophic weather events only make the situation worse. Bread, the main food of the poor, is suddenly much more expensive. The French decide to take things into their own hands. Food riots break out across the country, particularly in Paris.
Take what you can.
Hey, what's
Take
going
as much
on?
as you can carry. Do not leave anything behind.
Keep your hands
Do you hear
off.
me? Nothing.
Take what you can.
Take as
No.
much as you can
Take
carry.
as much as you
can carry. Do not leave anything.
Take all the bread.
And the king's soldiers simply stand back and watch. When order breaks down in the capital, they refuse to intervene against the revolutionaries. On the contrary, many side with the rebels because there is unrest in the army as well. By the late 1780s, there wasn't even enough money to cover monthly payments to the troops. A fully functional and strongly motivated army could easily have put down the small hunger riot at the Bastille. But France no longer possessed an army loyal enough to do that. On the morning of the 14th of July 1789, an angry Parisian crowd storms the notorious state prison in the Bastille fortress. Their anger is directed at this symbol of the tyranny inflicted on them by the king and nobility. The revolutionaries demand freedom, equality, and brotherhood. But are these ideals really compatible with one another? Contention over this question will shape the course of the revolution. In June 1789, the Third Estate breaks away from the other two orders and convenes an assembly. Its members see themselves as representatives of the entire nation. Open disagreement, debate now becomes a central motor of political life. Drawing on the legacy of the American Revolution, General Lafayette and Honoré Mirabeau draft a Bill of Human Rights.
Article 1. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions can be founded only on the common good. Article 2. The goal of any political association is the conservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, safety, and resistance against oppression.
Fearing that the revolution underway in France will threaten their security, the rulers of Prussia and Austria declare their military support for the French king. The armies marching to Paris in 1792 are stopped by French revolutionary forces in a battle at Valmy. Historical events begin to unfold at a breathtaking pace. France becomes a republic. The king has been deposed and is a prisoner of the people. He is put on trial. Both Louis XVI and his queen are beheaded by guillotine. France enters an era of profound political polarization and radicalization. The body count goes up. Increasingly, the French revolutionaries became armed missionaries, using violence to propagate their ideals, and that too is a European invention. The totalized application of a single political theory, whatever the human cost. Just across the river, in the Conciergerie prison, 2,780 people were swiftly processed by revolutionary tribunals and sentenced to death. And throughout the country, executions during this period numbered in the tens of thousands. The revolutionaries wanted to liberate all of humanity. That was one of the things that made them so radical. And the French National Assembly was the first organization in Europe, in the world, to pose the question of whether and how one state could use military force to enforce the observation of human rights in another state. The age of the humanitarian intervention was born. The French National Assembly hopes to offer strong resistance to Europe's monarchs and mobilizes the population with revolutionary slogans.
Now, let us show Europe the 10 million French citizens, when challenged, will be fueled by the fire of freedom. And armed with swords and reason, will single-handedly change the world and make the tyrants tremble on their thrones.
The future of the revolution is at stake. Ultimately, the advocates of war prevail.
Now, let us vote. Peace or war? Who votes for peace? And war?
Napoleon Bonaparte starts out as a general of the revolution, but once in power he brings the domestic tumult to an end and focuses on projecting French power outwards onto Europe. His battles are legendary and his conquests numerous. Napoleon plunges the continent into a state of constant war, and he leads his army from victory to victory. And then, Napoleon, a national hero at this point, names himself emperor. He is crowned in 1804. Napoleon casts himself as the successor to the Roman emperors, and especially to Charlemagne. Like his hero, he wants to create a European empire. In 1806, Prussian troops encounter the Grande Armée at Jena and Auerstedt in Thuringia. The Prussians suffer a harrowing defeat. Further annexations follow. Napoleon now dominates almost the whole of Europe, and he orchestrates his triumph accordingly. In Berlin, as in many other places, the response is ambivalent. Napoleon may be a tyrant to some, but to others, he's the herald of a new era. Napoleon and Europe. Some territories are simply annexed to France. Outside the borders of an enlarged France, Napoleon creates satellite states and confederations. Even great powers like Prussia and Austria, defeated by Napoleon, now pay tribute to him and accept his dominance. Napoleonic rule is a strange mix of military aggression, fiscal extraction, and progressive institutions. He hopes to bring progress wherever he rules. His Napoleonic Code promises civil rights, equal protection under the law, and freedom for peasants. But the mood darkens as Bonaparte wages war after war. There's no exit strategy, no limit to his ambition. Resistance grows. In 1813, the Battle of the Nations rages in Leipzig. A European alliance, including Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Sweden, mobilizes more than 300,000 troops against Napoleon. More than 200,000 soldiers, including Frenchmen, Italian, Poles, and Germans, fight on the side of France. Bonaparte is defeated. His dream of dominating the continent goes up in smoke. He may only have been 1.68 meters tall, but when it came to his sarcophagus, there was no such thing as too big. Here lie the mortal remains of Napoleon in 5 coffins, each nesting inside the other like a Russian doll, as though the French wanted to preserve their most important national myth for all eternity. Napoleon was one of the sculptors of modern Europe. His tools of preference were armies, legal codes, and administrative innovation. He was willing to use any means necessary to bring the nations of the old continent together as a family, united around and serving the motherland of human rights, France. He believed in open borders for people and goods and standardized weights and measures such as meters and kilos. And of course, the original standard meter on which all the others are based resides here in Paris. France as the measure of all things. The laws of France must extend to all the United Countries, from the Pillars of Hercules to the Kamchatka Peninsula, Napoleon is reported to have said. With Napoleon defeated and banished, new negotiations begin in Vienna. After 20 years of war, Austria, Russia, Prussia, and England are the victors. The objective is both to contain France and to block hegemonic projects by the other powers. France is invited to participate in a system that will come to be known as the Concert of Europe. The settlement hammered out in Vienna amidst a flurry of extravagant social events will define the future of Europe. Of course, the nations, the peoples as such, aren't involved in this process. They are objects to be acted upon, items on the negotiating agenda. The dynastic rulers view themselves as the guarantors of order in Europe. And the result is a security architecture that spans the continent. This is the final act of the Congress of Vienna. And here you can see the seals and the signatures of the statesmen who took part in the negotiations in Vienna. Here, Prince Metternich for Austria. Here, Talleyrand, French representative. And on this side, further significant figures, Hardenberg, Humboldt, and many others. The ultimate result of the Congress of Vienna, laid out in this final act, was in a sense the rebirth of Europe. Napoleon had a vision of a united Europe, of course, but it was a Europe united under his control and under French hegemony. The new Europe allocated more power to the peripheral empires of West and East. Great powers, Britain and Russia, were granted a stronger voice in determining the fate of the continent, a state of affairs that anticipated in some ways the later standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union. In the future, problems would be solved not by uncoordinated individual initiatives, but harmoniously through the so-called concert of powers. This, in some ways, very impressive and intelligent solution fell victim, like so many peace treaties, to the egoism of the most powerful states. One of Napoleon's unintended legacies was a surge in national feeling. Nothing galvanizes patriotic emotion like the experience of invasion and foreign domination. In May 1832, more than 20,000 people from Germany, France, Poland, and other countries gather at a palace in the Pfalz region of Western Germany. They call for a united Germany and a confederated Republic of Europe, as well as for freedom of the press, speech and assembly, and equal rights for women. Humbach is considered one of the cradles of modern democracy in Germany, and some see it as the birthplace of European unity. But the European vision was still formless and incoherent, and the old powers still dominated the continent. The kings and princes simply ignored the increasingly passionate demand for liberal reform. In 1848, another revolution breaks out. Once again, the French take to the streets, invoking the symbols and slogans of the French Revolution of 1789. But unlike the French Revolution, the Revolution of 1848 spreads like wildfire across Europe at a breathtaking pace.
From all over the country, deep from every heart, a strong, united German fatherland.
The revolution has won in Paris.
With the exception of England and Russia, nearly all the major European states are affected. In the simultaneity of its tumult across the continent, this revolution is unique. The people want social reform and liberal constitutions, and they're willing to use violence, if necessary, to get what they want. Full-blown revolutions rage in many cities, and revolutionary hotspots flare up across the continent. The people rise up against the dynasties of Europe under the banner of freedom and self-determination. A wave of revolutions rolled across Europe, from Palermo to Paris to Rome, Milan, Vienna, Budapest, and Berlin. Hope, frustration, and anger formed a combustible mix. The apparent unanimity of the revolutionary protests concealed a plurality of conflicting aims: political liberty, social justice, the unity of nations. In Central Europe, national identity, the desire to be united in a common state, was at the center of the revolutionary movement. In Germany, for example, the first freely elected German parliament convenes at St. Paul's Church in Frankfurt. The focus is on uniting the nation. The parliament is modeled on France's National Assembly. Parliaments during this era are still the domain of the elites. But how is a revolution expected to succeed without the support of an army? In most European nations, the army remains loyal to the rulers. There's little that militias or a network of revolutionaries can do against an armed military force. And yet the shock waves of this revolution would yield several important victories. New constitutions and parliaments are created, and censorship is scaled back. Many of the European states absorb and channel the energy of the revolution, selectively implementing its demands. And these political upheavals take place against the background of an even more profound transformation: the Industrial Revolution. Enormous factories spring up first in England and then nearly everywhere in Europe. With the invention of the steam engine, manual labor is increasingly replaced by machines. The process will take over a century. Why did all of this begin in England, of all places? For centuries, using the experimental method to probe the secrets of nature had been part of the culture here. So there was a long run-up. And then there was the pleasure that English scientists and inventors took in the practical application of their knowledge. They fueled the Industrial Revolution. And among them was James Watt, inventor of the steam engine. The water in this boiler is heated to steam, and the resulting pressure can be used to drive other engines, a loom, for example, or a locomotive. During the middle decades of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution spread in fits and starts across Europe. It was a peaceful conquest, but for many, the consequences were grave. Finally, people can free themselves of the constraints of agricultural production. Crop failures and famines that impact entire populations are a thing of the past in industrialized societies. But industrial work is poorly paid, dangerous, and exploitative. Until late in the 18th century, the only effective way of increasing the production of goods was to increase the number of humans employed to make them. Then the machines arrived. They didn't just replace muscle power, they also multiplied it. In factories like this one, huge machines performed the labor of hundreds of human beings. It was the most fundamental transformation in human social existence since the beginning of organized agriculture. In other words, it was a true revolution, an industrial revolution. The inventor of the term was none other than Karl Marx's close friend and collaborator, Friedrich Engels, who coined it in the 1830s in an analogy with the French Revolution of the 1790s. If the idea of communism had a birthplace, it would surely be Manchester. The unrestrained form of production that developed here came to be known as Manchester capitalism. In the mid-19th century, Friedrich Engels, whose father owned a factory like this one, could study as if in a laboratory the social and economic consequences of an unchecked capitalism. And in his writings, Karl Marx, Engels' friend, explored the implications.
Workers of the world unite.
Yes, that sounds good, but we need a strong message at the start.
The aim was to raise the workers against a system that kept them poor and weak.
That's good, that's good.
Yeah. Not bad. A spectre is haunting Europe.
The spectre of communism.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Marx lives in exile in London. In 1848, he and Friedrich Engels published their Communist Manifesto, which will one day become the Bible of the global workers' movement. Marx and Engels called for a world without exploitative social relations, in which the means of production are owned not by capitalists, but by society itself, understood as a collective enterprise. Both of them reflect at length on the idea of revolution, but it's not until the early 20th century that the explosive potential of their ideas is fully realized. Meanwhile, the gap between rich and poor continues to expand. A workers' movement soon begins to take shape, and with it come political parties championing the rights of waged labor. And thus Karl Marx, who incidentally claimed never to have been a Marxist, influenced European history in several ways at the same time. The idea of the working class as a structural feature of all modern capitalist systems united people across borders into a sort of community of fate. The slogan, "Workers of the world unite," offered a counterweight to national egotism. In the last decades of the 19th century, left-wing parties gained power and pushed through social reforms in dozens of European parliaments. Only under the immense social and political stresses of the First World War did the socialist left fracture. A communism emerged, in whose hands the teachings of Marx hardened into an unbending doctrine. As the instrument of Soviet state power, communism became a force of global significance, and in Europe, the tension between communist and capitalist social orders split the continent down the middle. It's the high noon of the national idea in every European country. In the course of the 19th century, the concept of nation becomes the pole star in the firmament of European values. But in Europe, where so many cultures and languages live in close proximity, one nation's dream can become another's nightmare. The leading monarchs of Europe are nearly all connected in the same gigantic clan network, and in 1913 many of them come together at the wedding of the German Emperor's daughter, Victoria Louisa, in Berlin. No one realizes just how close Europe is to the brink. This is the calm before the storm. An assassination in the multinational Habsburg state, the murder of the Austrian heir to the throne, captures the headlines. But does this automatically mean war? The great powers recognize the risk of escalation, but none of them does anything to prevent it. In 1914, the decision makers are like sleepwalkers. They maneuver for advantage, but in placing their own goals above the preservation of peace, they risk catastrophe. When war breaks out, each country sees itself as the victim and its opponent as the aggressor. Modern military technology means that this world war brings unparalleled carnage. Nearly 17 million people lose their lives on the battlefields and on the home front. And the First World War is a breaking point. The old European order collapses, but no new order emerges to take its place. The desire for compromise is there, but the differences between the fronts are overpowering. This is the dawn of an age of extremes shaped by fascism and Bolshevism. After the October Revolution in Russia, the Bolsheviks seize power. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin is the man of the hour. He keeps an iron grip on power and hopes that this Red Revolution will spread to the rest of Europe. Versailles, 1919. How can peace endure if Europe's two strongest powers play no role in the peacemaking process? Russia doesn't even send a representative to the European conference at Versailles. And the German delegation is barred from participating in the negotiations. With its reparations, disarmament clauses, and territorial penalties, and above all, with its insistence on German sole guilt for the outbreak of war, the Treaty of Versailles places a lasting burden on the new Weimar democracy. The multinational Habsburg Empire collapses. New independent nations arise in its place: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia. The Baltic countries also gain their independence. But the losers refuse to accept the new post-war order. Voices of protest grow louder, particularly from the right wing. Germany is being oppressed and robbed, they claim. There are signs of rapprochement between Germany and France at an international conference in Locarno in 1925. It's a time of hope. German Foreign Minister Gustav Stresemann speaks of a Europe of cooperation, not confrontation, and his French colleague Briand makes an impassioned speech. Away with the cannons, he says. Make way for reconciliation. Both statesmen are awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts, but this vision of a peaceful Europe would soon evaporate. The National Socialists promised to liberate Germany, to restore the country to its former strength and independence. Hitler isn't interested in the balance of power. He wants unconditional domination of the continent. Attempts to appease the new German leadership fail. The Nazis intend to secure their objectives by force. Rearmament begins in earnest as soon as they take power. September 1939. The war begins with the invasion of Poland. The Nazis couple the technology of invasion and conquest with the subjugation and extermination of the peoples under their control. The systematic slaughter of civilians sets this war apart from past conflicts right from the very beginning. The Holocaust begins behind the front lines. It will claim the lives of 6 million Jews. May 1940. The German Wehrmacht attacks its neighbor to the west. Hitler always adheres to the same binary principle: all or nothing. Germany will be a great power, or it will cease to exist, he declares in his book Mein Kampf, published years before he comes to power. With his victory secure, Hitler visits Paris. Among the sightseeing stops is Napoleon's tomb at the Dôme des Invalides. He plans to surpass even the French emperor's prowess as a military leader, but his memory of Napoleon's achievements is selective. He seems to have forgotten the fact that Napoleon's invasion of Russia proved the disaster that undid his empire. The Nazi ideology leads further into ruin. The Siegessäule, or victory column of Berlin, was supposed to serve as an important element on the great east-west axis of the capital city of the Third Reich, Germania. In Hitler's grotesque vision, the megapolis, Germania, bulging with oversized monuments, was to be the focal point of a pan-Germanic world empire. The Nazis liked the mural at the base of the victory column. We see an aroused German people raising their swords against Napoleon, who's dressed like a Roman emperor in a red toga. An historical event, the early 19th century wars of liberation against Napoleonic France, is elevated to the status of a world historical principle. For the Nazis, the state was an obsolete concept. They thought in ethnic, racial, rather than political categories. When Hitler imagined Europe, it was not the Europe of states, but a continental platform, a petri dish inhabited by biological cultures, one in which the Germans would simply expand like a bacterial colony. Lebensraum, the German word for habitat, has nothing to do with politics. It's a concept from biology. In Europe, only the fittest were supposed to survive. Every being strives for expansion, Hitler wrote, and every nation strives for world dominion. Only those who keep this goal in mind will find the right path. The war Hitler launched on Central and Eastern Europe was a war of annihilation and enslavement, a war against the diversity of Europe's peoples and cultures. It was a war against Europe's history. The consequence was an unfathomable break with culture and civilization. And today's Europe is still deeply marked by this conflict. In June 1941 came the invasion of the Soviet Union, a campaign of unexampled extermination to expand Germany's territory to the east. The dictator wants to create a German Europe from the Atlantic to the Ural Mountains. The Second World War would cost 60 to 70 million human lives, the majority civilians. The Holocaust, millions of slaughtered Slavs, bombing campaigns, prisoner of war camps, refugees and displaced persons, the war left a traumatized generation in its wake. I'm in Kiev, where an enormous statue commemorates the Great Patriotic War as the struggle against Hitler's Germany is known in Russia. The fighting here was particularly violent. In a place like this, you can still feel the horror, the iron hand of war. These are the Bloodlands, areas where two totalitarian powers fought over the same space in a life and death struggle for supremacy. Millions died, millions more were murdered, and even before the Second World War, millions had perished in a man-made famine engineered by Joseph Stalin to break the national will of the Ukraine. Hitler's war of annihilation claimed further millions of lives. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers died in battles of encirclement or in POW camps. The country was plundered, people starved, and a new wave of famines. There have been phases in the history of Europe where the violence was so devastating that the thread of memory was severed. The intimacy with the past was disrupted. Only trauma remained. These are the killing fields of Europe. In 1945, it seemed unimaginable that Europe would ever re-emerge from the abyss it had created for itself. Everyone suffered in this terrible war. Tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians lost their lives, German invaders and Russians alike. There is a story, a grieving family behind every headstone. The military cemeteries in Ukraine bear witness to the countless dead on both sides. But the most terrible, the cruelest fate was suffered by the Jews. There was a campaign of extermination against the entire Jewish population of Kiev. And on this precise spot, the bloodiest mass shooting of Jews took place. If the name Auschwitz stands for industrial mass murder by the Nazis in gas chambers, Babi Yar, near Kiev, stands for the murder by shooting of tens of thousands of defenseless men, women, and children. Holocaust by bullet. On the 29th and 30th of September 1941, in this ravine near Kiev, 33,000 Jewish men, women, and children were shot. The Jewish population, whose roots here extended back for centuries, was annihilated by Hitler's henchmen. Babi Yar and Auschwitz, the nadir of the history of Europe, which had had such a high view of its own civilization. June the 6th, 1944, D-Day. The tides of war begin to turn. With the Allied attack on Normandy, the assault on Hitler's fortress Europe begins. The victorious powers want to put an end to the Nazi dictatorship once and for all. Never again should war originate from German soil, nor should one European power subjugate the others. Above all, the humanitarian catastrophe of the war should never be repeated. I'm standing in the old Jewish cemetery in Vienna. This is one of those places that reminds you of what was lost to Europe through the Holocaust. The industrialized killing centers of the Nazi genocide were unique in history, but so were their victims. Since the Middle Ages, Jewish culture, know-how, and scholarship had left a deep imprint on Europe. Heinrich Heine, Franz Kafka, Marcel Proust, Stefan Zweig, Sigmund Freud, Hannah Arendt, Felix Mendelssohn, Gustav Mahler, Marc Chagall, Albert Einstein. You could add countless further names. The Holocaust put a brutal end to this remarkable history of cultural symbiosis. Europe has never quite recovered from this act of self-mutilation. 0 hour. The war is over. The Nazis' attempt to dominate the continent ends in catastrophe. Huge swathes of Europe lie in ruins. Buildings will be rebuilt, but the trauma will remain. At a conference in Potsdam near Berlin, the victorious Allies negotiate the post-war order, the future of Europe. The heads of state of the three Allied powers come together here: US President Truman, Soviet dictator Stalin, and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. When Churchill arrived on a hot July day, the first thing he did was to order a whiskey and a cigar. He spent a long time looking out over the peaceful Griebnitz Lake. A Soviet sentry could be seen patrolling along the opposite shore. And perhaps Churchill reflected on how Europe would in future be divided into East and West. The Allies have won the war together, and together they want to work towards peace and to shape the future of Europe. But alliances rarely survive the wars they are created to fight. And now that their mutual enemy is defeated, the victorious Allies begin to discover their differences as they sit talking at this table. After this war, the preeminent position of the old European continent was a thing of the past. Moscow and Washington now called the shots in Europe and would do so in the decades to come. Europe, like the world, would be divided, embedded in two opposing blocs. And this too was Hitler's work. The aim of defeating Nazi Germany had united the world's two greatest powers in a struggle that brought them together in the heart of the continent. But when it came to shaping the peace, the tensions between two radically opposed systems proved impossible to contain. The so-called Iron Curtain separated the capitalist from the communist world, and did so in the very center of Europe. The The Western powers' zones of occupation become the Federal Republic of Germany. In the east, the Soviet Union creates a bloc of socialist satellite states, which includes East Germany. The continent splits into a mainly capitalist and liberal democratic region and a communist region, and the two alliance blocs keep each other in check. The term balance of terror is often used in this era of nuclear arms buildup. Meanwhile, in The Hague, European leaders take up an idea that failed to acquire traction between the two world wars, the vision of a Europe united in peace and freedom.
We cannot aim at anything less than the union of Europe as a whole.
Winston Churchill even floats the idea of a United States of Europe. This goes too far for many Europeans, but the heads of state managed to agree on the creation of the Council of Europe in Strasbourg. It's the precursor to the future European Community and to the EU. In May 1949, 10 founding fathers signed this institution into existence. A Western European Forum for Freedom, Peace and Social Justice is born. The hope is that a spirit of solidarity will blossom from the conflict of the past. Shared values and symbols are at the heart of this project. Konrad Adenauer, the first Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, sees an opportunity in this bond with Europe. By collaborating with the Western allies, he hopes to lead Germany back into the family of free peoples, or at least West Germany, even if doing so intensifies the division between the eastern and western halves of his country. The West German government's goal is to peacefully overcome the division of Germany and Europe. But what's the first step? Building bridges with France. France's Foreign Minister Schuman already has a plan. If we want to prevent war in the future, he argues, the coal and steel industries in various European countries, vital to any war effort, ought to be consolidated under one roof. In 1952, the European Coal and Steel Union is born.
Now, iron and steel shall forge the peoples of Europe together in a community of actions and ideals.
Just 7 years after the war, national sovereignty over a crucial military resource is handed over to an international body, a world historical step. As the economy recovers, Europeans grow more mobile. Their horizons broaden. They drive their own cars or motorbikes or hitchhike to new destinations, traveling through a Europe that was opening up to the world. Today, we take it for granted. As early as the 1950s, some young Europeans are already calling for open borders. That's still a long way off at this point, particularly since a few early attempts at expanding the community failed. But the campaigners refuse to be deterred. And once again, all roads lead to Rome. The Roman Empire was one of the largest in history, and the EU would later become the world's largest trading power. In 1957, representatives of West Germany, France, Italy, and the Benelux countries come together in Rome to establish the European Economic Community. The EEC also results in closer political ties between the countries. It's open to new members and plans to expand its powers step by step, building the foundation for a shared future. Ancient Rome eventually fell, of course, thanks to financial crises, political conflict, and barbarian invasions. And Europe has its own share of tensions today, the divide between North and South, the Euro crisis, immigration policies. These are all challenges that the continent will continue to face. But the European political order is robust. It's underpinned by long-standing common values, civil and political freedom, equality before the law, democracy, human dignity, and a rational view of the world. This order is now in danger. If Europeans really want to inhabit a common house, they will have to make it so strong that it can withstand storms and earthquakes, even those that come from within. This can be learned. And wasn't Europe always a continent that learned? Europe. No other continent on Earth has as much natural and cultural diversity crammed into such a small area. The tension between unity and division has been one of the central themes of European history. And today it is still the cardinal question facing Europe's political leaders. The European continent was in a constant state of flux, not just politically, but also in its mental life. Everything was called into question. For every idea, there was a counter-idea. A kind of restlessness has always characterized the intellectual life of Europe. The most diverse cultures collide in the confined and fragmented space of the European peninsula. And the result was almost always violence. Europe, a continent at war. In no other part of the world has there been such intense and sustained fighting over power, religion, and dominance. Again and again, Europeans have striven to make peace. Some peace settlements were robust and durable, others were not. The world's most devastating wars originated on this continent. The First World War, the seminal catastrophe of the 20th century. The Second World War changed the face of Europe forever. Here in Kiev, in Ukraine, the battles were particularly ferocious. Hitler wants to subjugate Europe and challenge the global hegemony of the English-speaking peoples. The Nazis' demented expansion plans, their campaign for Lebensraum, ends in unparalleled destruction and crimes against humanity. The Second World War left Europe in ruins and sundered the continent into two zones of influence. The Allies have won the war, and together they want to shape the peace. US President Truman, Soviet dictator Stalin, and British Prime Minister Churchill will divide the continent between them. I've traveled to Reims in France, where the German Wehrmacht signed its unconditional surrender in 1945. In 1962, the German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer and the French President Charles de Gaulle come to this city to celebrate the reconciliation of their two countries. The French greet Adenauer with rousing cheers, something that was not to be taken for granted, especially in this city. It was an important moment for Europe when two statesmen from Germany and France, Konrad Adenauer and Charles de Gaulle, specifically chose Reims as the location to hold a mass of reconciliation. For many Germans, Reims was the place where the Wehrmacht had signed an agreement of unconditional surrender to the Allies at the American headquarters on the 7th of May 1945. For the French, the symbolic importance of Reims was even greater. This was where the coronations of French kings had been held. The cathedral was severely damaged by German artillery fire at the beginning of World War I. In fact, Reims was so completely devastated and suffered so many deaths during the First World War that it was granted the official title of Ville Martyre, martyred city. And now, 17 years after an even more horrific World War, history turned a corner. Hostility made way for friendship. It was miracles of reconciliation like this that laid the foundations of a united Europe. The Mass for Reconciliation is the beginning of a budding relationship between the two peoples and a successful partnership between the German Chancellery and the Élysée Palace, a partnership that would become the heart of the European community and the principal motor of its political evolution. It remains so even today. Redemption and relief after centuries of animosity. The two countries' shared Christian roots were a great help in this process. But is Christianity still a factor in these relationships? Go into a church in Western Europe and you may well find it empty, even during the religious service. And yet, when I travel in Europe, I'm constantly struck by the deep imprint Christianity has left on all domains of European life. The endless variety of ecclesiastical buildings, the omnipresence of religious images in art and music. Europe is often described as a secular or post-Christian continent, and you can see why. But the wellspring is not entirely dry, and the continuing power of this tradition should not be underestimated. Even within the circle of Europe's political leaders, there are signs of a revival of Christian commitments. As an Australian, I come from a continent with no internal political borders. Europe still has national borders, of course, even if they're open and barely visible today. Here, for example, in Leidingen, in Saarland, one town, two countries. Here in this little village, we can experience European history firsthand. In 1814, after the Congress of Vienna, this road became the border between Germany and France, carving up the village that the great powers had treated as a pawn for the previous 200 years. Sometimes it was French, sometimes it was German. Now it's one thing above all, European. But there are still differences between the two parts of the village. Here I'm in France, in Lorraine, and on the other side of the road is the German state of Saarland. They have two fire departments and two mail services, but one language unites the people here, the Moselle-Franconian dialect that has survived on both sides of the border. I'm meeting with the two mayors of Leidingen. What does Europe mean to them?
Europa bedeutet für mich keine Kriege mehr. Das heißt, was hier passiert ist, hier sind die Armeen ja aufmarschiert. Hier wurde 7-mal die Grenze verändert, aber immer Militär da. Das heißt, und das ist die Hoffnung für mich Europa, dass wir keinen Krieg mehr haben.
Wir fühlen uns als Europäer. Da waren ja auch die französische Flagge weggemacht und dann die europäische dahin gemacht. Der Unterschied ist ja auch drin, der französische Bäcker, der bringt die Baguette, der hat nicht das Schwarzbrot wie auf der deutschen Seite, und der deutsche Bäcker bringt das deutsche Brot und so. Jetzt kommen wir in der neutralen Straße zwei verschiedene Bäcker. Also hat man auch verschiedene Art zu essen.
Things that belong together for all of their differences are finally growing together in Europe. Another town, another border. This fence still stands as a reminder of a bygone era. It divided not only the town of Mödlareuth and the families that lived there, it also separated Germany and Europe into East and West. The East German regime even built a wall through this town that looked a little like the one in Berlin. The border dividing Germany, cutting through the heart of Europe, is expanded and reinforced throughout the 1960s. The East German government refers to it as an anti-fascist protective rampart. In fact, its true purpose is to ensure that no more East German citizens can escape to the West. More than 3 million people had already done so by 1961 when the wall was built. Fleeing the Eastern Republic means risking death. In the 1970s, relations between East and West begin to thaw. For the first time, a West German chancellor visits the East, Willy Brandt. The goal is to achieve gradual change through rapprochement between the two states. West Germany signs treaties with Moscow and Warsaw, and Willy Brandt is awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. One important objective of these agreements is the avoidance of war. But the period of détente doesn't last long. After all, the tension between these two very different worldviews is fundamental to the global political order. Communism and dictatorship on one side, capitalism and democracy on the other. Life is more hectic and more prosperous in the West. The border between the two blocs slices straight through the heart of Europe. Only a few European countries remain outside these blocs: Sweden and Finland, Ireland, Austria, Switzerland, and Yugoslavia. By the end of the 1970s, the two blocs are engaged in a fierce arms race. Throughout this ideological and geopolitical conflict, there are always phases of escalation and détente. The benefits and risks of deterrence are the subject of heated debate in the West well into the mid-1980s. Military exercises for a war that can never be allowed to happen. Any open conflict in this atmosphere would inevitably have gone beyond a mere exchange of blows. Both sides have massive stockpiles of nuclear weapons. The heart of Europe is a potential battlefield in an escalating nuclear standoff. The events of August 1980 finally spell the beginning of the end for a divided Europe. Strikes and protests erupt in Poland, calling for greater freedom under the communist dictatorship. They are spurred on by the Solidarność labor union and with the blessing and assistance of a Polish pope who believes that solidarity and political freedom are Christian and European values. And suddenly, Europe's division seems surmountable. It's Moscow, of all places, that sets the avalanche in motion. In 1985, the new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, launches a sweeping transformation of the Soviet system. Gorbachev, an extraordinary statesman whose broad and humane vision restarted European history.
Worse than being blind is not wanting to see. It was Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, of all people, who said that. His political heirs didn't want to see. The communist system of government collapsed because it was forced upon the people by a political elite. It was a regime of hyper-regulation that led to shortages and underdevelopment. Mikhail Gorbachev famously remarked, "He who comes too late is punished by life." Whether he ever uttered this elegant aphorism in exactly those words is disputed, but we do know for certain that he made the following statement in front of the East German Politburo, and I quote, "If we lag behind the times, life will immediately punish us." And indeed, after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, an enormous wave of change rolled across Eastern Europe and ultimately the whole of the continent. And Leningrad became St. Petersburg once again.
The turning point comes in 1989, 200 years after French revolutionaries stormed the Bastille prison in Paris. Both revolutions bring down autocratic regimes. The Berlin Wall, a long-standing symbol of oppression, finally falls. The people peacefully push open the gate to unity. Some of Germany's European partners are initially unsettled when the country begins to consider reunification, but the European community stands by its commitments to freedom and self-determination. And the European Union has the opportunity to grow. Increasing numbers of former Eastern Bloc countries join its ranks, including Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and Slovenia. Gradually, a community with its roots in the West becomes a union of 28 states throughout Europe.
Our journey through the history of Europe shows just how much this continent has already achieved. Europe has learned from its history. It's put the battlefields behind it. It's formed its own union. Conflict and uneasy coexistence became partnership, earning the EU the Nobel Peace Prize. The prize was well-deserved, but the Union can't afford to rest on its laurels. Peace and security in Europe are being put to the test right now in a way we haven't seen since the Cold War. The European Union is increasingly going to have to take responsibility for its own security and rely less on external support.
The Ukraine conflict made this crystal clear as Europe drifted into a new East-West conflict. After Russia, Ukraine is the largest country in Europe. It's been independent since 1991, but the Ukrainian government put an abrupt halt to the country's growing rapprochement with the EU in November 2013. Protests by Western-minded Ukrainians at the Maidan Square in Kiev were the result. The clashes at the Maidan grew more violent in the months that followed, A new Ukrainian government was elected, but at the same time, pro-Russian separatist forces staged an uprising in eastern Ukraine. This conflict between East and West permeates the entire country. Geographically, politically, and culturally, Ukraine belongs to both sides. What do people in Kiev think of Europe today?
Мы как-то себя не отделяли от Европы, в общем-то. Считаем, что и есть Европа.
Europe is our better future. So perhaps Ukraine is historically a European state, because till the beginning of the 16th century it was the part of Lithuania. Perhaps we should go back to Europe, because our mutual history with Russia shows some bad results which we face now, and perhaps our European integration may cause some good results to our state.
Идея Европы – это, наверное, самые лучшие ценности, которые могут быть в мире. Что такое идея Европы? Демократия, толерантность, свобода выбора.
But these ideals are constantly being called into question. Who can the citizens of Ukraine rely on?
The churches still play an important role here, and this was clearly in evidence during the events on Maidan Square in 2013, when police beat student protesters who had gathered to demonstrate in favor of the association agreement with the European Union. Some of those protesters sought refuge in this cathedral. A priest had opened the gate to them. The police pursued them, but only as far as the gate. They didn't dare to venture inside the church itself. It was the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, incidentally, that offered a refuge to the protesters. The Russian Orthodox authorities remained passive bystanders.
In that sense, the conflict struck at the heart of the Orthodox Church. Most Ukrainian congregations insist on their independence and view the Moscow Patriarchy as an extension of Russian President Putin's influence. Vladimir Putin keeps a tight grip on the reins. Since he won the presidential election in 1999, he has remained firmly in the seat of power. Putin's policy of countering Western initiatives with provocations of his own leads to confrontation, but it plays brilliantly with the Russian population. Military units loyal to Moscow marching into eastern Ukraine, the Russian annexation of Crimea, and Putin's involvement in Syria are all events that bolster his strongman image. The Kremlin even tried to manipulate the American presidential elections in 2016, though there's still disagreement on how effective these efforts were. And in 2017, a populist moved into the White House, Donald Trump. National egoism is fashionable again, and it looks similar in every country.
America first! Again! America first!
National pride has always been a crowd pleaser.
Да здравствует Россия!
Europe can only continue to exist as a sovereign community if it resists nationalist unilateralism. But how can the continent achieve that level of sovereignty? Only by reflecting confidently on its past, the strengths and values that have evolved over millennia, can Europe replenish its vision of the future.
A German politician, Theodor Heuss, once said that modern Europe was built on three hills: the Athenian Acropolis, meaning freedom and democracy, the Capitoline Hill in Rome, meaning respect for the law and state authority, and Golgotha, meaning the Christian tradition. It's a nice piece of rhetoric, but the reality is more complex. Many European countries have only recently embraced democracy, and in some member states, the rule of law cannot be taken for granted.
The road to democracy was a rocky and intermittent one, and traveling it took nearly 2,500 years. The Greeks took the first steps. But of course, ancient Greek democracy didn't have much in common with our modern parliaments or with our democratic processes, and the first Athenian democracy only lasted for just under 200 years. Yet ancient Athens remains our political model today. Rome was a republic, but it wasn't a democracy. Even if there were public assemblies and a senate, the system wasn't immune to the whims of tyrannical rulers who saw themselves as gods. But it was during this era that Roman law was invented, and the rule of law is as important to the success of democracy as elections and parliaments. Being part of the Roman Empire meant being part of a perfectly organized European community for countries and citizens alike. Engineering, architecture, international trade and prosperity. It's almost as though we're talking about modern Europe. In that sense, Rome is more than just history. It's also very much the present. In the 9th century, the Frankish king Charlemagne would begin to build on the foundations first laid by the empire in Rome. Even back then, he had a vision for Europe. On Christmas Day in the year 800, he is crowned Roman Emperor by the Pope, and the glory and majesty of the Roman Empire passes into the hands of the Franks. Aachen, Charlemagne's favorite palace, becomes the cultural heart of the continent, and the emperor a father figure to the whole of Europe. A standardized writing system, binding laws, currency, Charlemagne even promotes the arts and education. Monarchy and church would continue to dominate the public life of Europe for centuries to come. Of course, the freedoms that we take for granted in Europe today were unknown. But church and state were constantly at each other's throats, and by keeping each other in check, they created a certain room for political maneuver. Popular resistance to traditional authority was another driver of change. Martin Luther attacks the papal church and speaks of a priesthood of all believers who answer only to God. The Reformation spreads swiftly across Central and Northern Europe. It creates an environment where people begin to question authority. The spirit of revolution would only grow stronger in the centuries to come, and the rulers of Europe would feel its effects. Among those who bear the brunt of popular upheaval are the French royal family. In late 18th century France, the crown wields the full power of the French state. Versailles is the heart of it all, and the king is the sun around which everything revolves. Well, not for long. The French Revolution erupts. The key words of the revolutionary movement are strident signals to the rest of Europe. Freedom, equality, brotherhood. The French Revolution would change the continent and the world forever. The revolution brought the concept of the separation of powers to the fore in Europe. In the decades that followed, elected parliaments became increasingly common, giving ordinary Europeans a first, albeit quiet, voice in determining their own fate. There has been a directly elected European Parliament in Strasbourg for nearly 40 years now. All members of the Parliament proudly speak their own languages. This Parliament is the only directly elected supranational institution in the world. What is Europe? It's a place, but it's also a utopia, an imagined land that can't be found on the map of the present. But the search for such a utopia has helped this continent make progress over the last 70 years. The EU Parliament, for example, is a directly elected EU institution. Perhaps one day this Parliament will elect a European government. An EU government based on solid democratic principles could help Europe solve countless crises in the future. But let's not forget, democracy is messy. With every freedom comes a risk. There'll never be a perfect Europe. It's simply too diverse a place for that. But a utopia can be a good compass if it's anchored in strong values. The European ideal is like the stars. We may never reach them, but they guide us on our way. Europeans have trodden many paths in the course of their history. In the 4th century, the entire continent was in turmoil all the way to the shores of the Mediterranean. From that point on, it would be the Germanic tribes north of the Alps, and not Rome, that determined the continent's fate. European history has never been about a single culture. It's a conglomeration of many cultures that have come together and broken apart again. Europeans' relations with one another had less to do with harmony and unity than with competition between tribes, cities, and religions. I'm in Italy, a country where this continent's history can still be experienced firsthand. For me, the medieval city of Siena is a Europe in miniature. For centuries, its 17 districts, the contrade, have formed a community within the city walls, yet all are in competition with each other. And once a year, there's the Palio, a horse race in which the contrade compete against one another. This competition is taken very seriously, and there it is again, the old competitive spirit that once made Europe what it became. Everyone for themselves, the community for all. And over there in the town hall, in the 14th century, the painter Ambrogio Lorenzetti captured in a nutshell what it means to govern a community. He called his work the allegory of good and bad government. In it, you can see both sides of European history. While the tyrant rules as a devil with horns and fangs, the wise ruler lives for the peace and prosperity of his subjects, flanked by the cardinal virtues. But what happens next? How will the story continue? Today, demagogues are everywhere in Europe, keener on trumpeting nationalism than on strengthening the community. They would have landed up on the dark side of Lorenzetti's depiction. Incidentally, the cultural integration of migrants may well have been invented here in Siena. It's here that the first ever historically documented language courses for foreigners were offered to Germans who settled in the city. And that was in the year 1588. Internal migration has a long history in Europe. Take the Huguenots, for example. These French Protestants were persecuted by the Catholic majority in their home country, and in the 17th and 18th centuries, they fled to Germany, England, Ireland, and the English colonies in North America. With his Edict of Potsdam, Elector Frederick William invited tens of thousands of migrant Huguenots to Brandenburg in 1685. The migrants were now free to practice their religion, and the towns where they settled benefited from their know-how and their business sense. Post-war Germany invited its first official guest workers, as they were known, from Italy. They helped Germany manage the extra workload created by its economic revival. Job seekers from Greece, Spain, Turkey, Morocco, Portugal, Tunisia, and Yugoslavia followed in the 1960s, and East Germany welcomed its own guest workers from its socialist sister countries in Asia. Today, it's clear that there is a strong current of migration throughout the entire European Union. Nearly 1 million Europeans move to a different country every year. Once again, the continent is mingling and blending. The number of immigrants from other continents, on the other hand, has declined slightly. The percentage of foreigners living in European countries differs widely from place to place. In some countries, migrants are naturalized and no longer count as foreigners. This is particularly the case for countries with a colonial past, such as France or Great Britain. Then, as now, immigration is vital to the economic and demographic future of the European Union. The experience of migration has also involved encounters with other religions. People exchange more than just goods and labor, they also learn about each other's cultures. Turkey in particular, as the successor state to the Ottoman Empire, was a gateway between East and West. Kemal Atatürk modernized his country, led it into independence, and promoted a progressive version of Islam. Education was his top priority, and today it remains the key to successful cultural and social integration. According to a new study, the majority of Muslim immigrants in Western Europe are fully integrated into society by the second generation at the latest. They have rights and responsibilities and the freedom to choose their own path in life. Naturally, they are an equal part of European society. They have the same inalienable rights as all their fellow citizens, including the right to freely practice their religion. But the right to freedom of religion ends when the freedoms of others are restricted or called into question. This abuse of religious freedom can take extreme forms, as in the use of hate speech in sermons, calls for a theocratic state that will supersede democratic institutions, incitement to violence or terror. Since the early 2000s, a tiny minority of radical Islamists have been challenging the peaceful coexistence of the religions in Europe. Tolerance only works when there is agreement on basic values. The vast majority of Muslims want nothing to do with a radical, politicized version of Islam, and anyone who hopes to use Europe's freedoms against it in the name of religion should take another look at European history. For over 700 years, Muslims ruled the Iberian Peninsula, with Granada and the Alhambra at the center of their empire. They practiced a certain pragmatic tolerance. They attracted Jewish and Christian scholars to their academies, where scholars worked together on important projects. The ancient writings collected by the Arabs were translated into Latin, making them accessible to Christian Europe and preserving them for generations to come. It was a golden age where ideology took a backseat, an eloquent historical rejoinder to the arguments of today's fundamentalists. In Europe, both sides of the immigration process have to prove that integration can work, regardless of where the new arrivals come from and irrespective of their religion. Sport, and football in particular, is a great example of successful integration in practice.
National football teams have long reflected the process of cultural integration in Europe. Just take a look at the players' names: David Alaba, Mesut Özil, Bril Embolo, Sami Khedira, or Omar El Abdellaoui. Second and third generation children of immigrants are now playing on the national teams of the countries where they grew up. In Europe, as in many other parts of the world, sport is a domain of accelerated social integration. Diversity often becomes visible here long before it's a reality in society at large.
You could see these teams and their national anthems as an anticipatory embodiment of Europe's future. It's no wonder that Europe has become a dream destination for so many people. From December 2010, a wave of protests and revolutions swept through many Arab countries, including Egypt. Frustration at the corruption and repression of autocratic regimes had reached boiling point. Here in Cairo, as in Tunisia and Libya, the people overthrew their authoritarian rulers, but the revolutionary fervor of the Arab Spring has since all but dissipated. In Africa, too, there are many crisis zones. Sudan, Mali, Somalia, many countries on the African continent are menaced by terror and constant uncertainty. It's no wonder that many see no future for themselves, or that they're forced to flee from imminent danger. Across North Africa, in Jordan and in Turkey, there are up to 6.6 million refugees waiting to continue their journey. They want to travel on to prosperous countries where their human rights will be respected, including their right to asylum.
The word asylum has been around for 3,500 years. It comes from the ancient Greek, and it refers to the protection of people and things that are in danger. The ancient Temple of Apollo at Delphi and other sanctuaries were places where asylum was granted. And here,
On the Capitoline Hill in Rome, Romulus is said to have established an asylum. He was one of the two legendary brothers. The other was Remus, who, raised by a she-wolf, became the founders of the ancient city of Rome. Europe is still struggling to find the right approach to asylum. Simply throwing open the gates is not the answer. Shutting them forever won't work either. But a common solution must be found. Asylum is an old European tradition. In the 17th century, when 250,000 French Protestants, the Huguenots, were forced to flee from France, they found sanctuary in neighboring countries. After the French Revolution, there were also many political refugees who were granted asylum. Today, more than 200 years later, the whole of Europe faces the challenge of accepting refugees from other parts of the world in the name of the very human rights that Europeans once postulated and took for granted. A look back into history can be illuminating for all Europeans. Nationalists have seen gains at the polls throughout Europe. Immigration is a topic that unites them all. They want to create a fortress Europe, closed to the outside world and without a true union behind its walls. Europe won't even be able to begin tackling its many problems until its countries finally manage to work together, to speak with one voice. But Europe is divided. Some are even beginning to wonder if the EU will collapse. In June 2016, the British decided to leave the Union. Many people, myself included, believe that this is the wrong decision because the European Union offers a strong form of protection and solidarity in an unpredictable world. But whether or not the UK remains in the EU, the relationship between the two will remain a vital one for both sides. The important thing is for the United Kingdom and Europe to remain partners, as Winston Churchill would have wanted. The 23rd of June 2016 is a date that no European is likely to forget anytime soon. The day on which the United Kingdom opted to say goodbye to the European Union. It was a wrenching decision for this country. Some welcomed the departure as a return to sovereignty and independence. Others feared that the nation would retreat into a self-imposed isolation to warm its hands over the memory of a glorious past. It felt and feels like a new and unprecedented turn in this country's fortunes. And yet this is not the first Brexit. There was another Brexit back in the year 286 AD, when the province of Britannia left the Roman Empire, which at that time, of course, united most of Europe. Too many taxes, too much Roman feudalism. An admiral with Welsh roots named Carausius declared himself ruler of Britain and led the province out of the Union and into liberty. He even had the word libertas embossed onto coins bearing his likeness. Incidentally, that ancient Brexit lasted just 10 years before the island returned to the Roman Empire. There are many people in the UK who still dream of the glory days of the British Empire and want nothing to do with the EU. But the majority of young people would prefer to maintain their close ties to the continent. What values do you associate with Europe then?
With democracy, equality, opportunity, yeah, everything is that people feeling passionately.
Down there in Brussels beats the heart of the largest economic area in the world. There are 500 million producers and consumers in Europe. The European Union accounts for barely 7% of the world's population, but trade between the EU and the rest of the world makes up 15% of global imports and exports. Alongside the US and China, the EU was one of the 3 biggest global players in international trade. All this and more is coordinated and controlled from Brussels through the implementation of standards and rules. Europe has sometimes been called a gentle monster, and there is something monstrous about the collection of standards and norms that Brussels imposes on the 500 million citizens of Europe. At last count, they filled 150,000 pages of text. The regulating bodies of the Union do more than just stipulate the kind of lights that Europeans can have in their living rooms.
They also cover the distance between the bars on our backyard barbecue grills, the way a pizza has to be baked, and the length of a banana. It can sometimes be a bit tedious, but nation-states also have norms. In fact, all modern states do. And they're all the more important when you are a union of 28 once independent states. As for those who are always whinging about European norms, they should not forget that conflicts on this continent, even quite trivial ones, used to be fought out on the battlefield.
In a Europe without borders, everyone has the opportunity to savor the continent's diversity in the truest sense of the word. Despite the plethora of EU standards, this continent still boasts more than 70 different regional cuisines. So it's perhaps surprising that when it comes to drinking culture in Europe, there are really only two camps. For those in Northern and Eastern Europe, beer is the essential beverage, while in the West and the South, most people still prefer to drink wine. And this division has ancient roots. The Romans cultivated the grape and enjoyed its fermented juice. As their legions conquered more and more territory, wine growing and wine drinking grew increasingly popular throughout Europe. There was even a Roman god of wine, Bacchus. In the territories not under Roman rule, beer remained the beverage of choice. 2,000 years ago, the Roman historian Tacitus wrote, "The Germanic peoples love beer above all things. They can endure cold and hunger, but not thirst." And that is still the case today. A transnational beverage boundary still cuts right across Europe, although it has become more fluid in recent years. Plenty of Europeans are happy to drink both beer and wine. There are EU norms that apply to beer and wine as well. In his Capitulare de Villis, Charlemagne laid out rules and regulations for wine cultivation throughout the Frankish Empire and stipulated around 60 herbs and spice plants which were to be grown in the gardens of his subjects. He seems to have invented European norms and standards, and he even created a European currency, the Charlemagne denarius, an early euro, so to speak. When the modern euro was introduced, it was initially greeted with euphoria, at least in the areas where it was in use. The hope was that a shared currency for Europe would bind the continent together and make most of its citizens happy. Then came the euro crisis of 2009. The Greek government was on the verge of bankruptcy. Bailouts, aid packages, billions upon billions were pumped into the country. Up to this point, the Eurozone had been a currency union without political traction. And the way this now chronic crisis has been handled should be a cautionary tale. European countries exhibit very different behavior in such situations. Old myths and stereotypes can resurface on all sides, while other more important lessons from history can often be forgotten. In times of crisis, hardened attitudes can prevent people from acting rationally. We're easily lured into believing that we are being manipulated by outside forces, especially when political transparency is lacking. But there are deep advantages to European solidarity.
Όχι μόνο για τους Γερμανούς, γενικά για όλους τους Ευρωπαίους και για όλο τον κόσμο γενικώς, έχουν την άποψη ότι οι λαοί δεν ευθύνονται για τίποτα για ό,τι συμβαίνει σήμερα στην παγκόσμια σκακέρα.
Τι σημαίνει Ευρώπη για την Ελλάδα?
Είναι σαν μια μεγάλη ομάδα για μας που ας πούμε μπορεί να μας στηρίξει αν χρειαστεί. Αλλά και για μας είναι καλό να είμαστε μέλος της γιατί αισθανόμαστε ότι προοδεύουμε έτσι.
But isn't it true, in fact, that the European community must also be a community of solidarity, whose members are prepared to share with one another? Ultimately, this means that all members have to vouch for another member facing bankruptcy. But this transnational solidarity is a value many people find it difficult to embrace, particularly in the wealthy creditor countries of the EU. The poor South and the wealthy North, the gap between North and South in Europe remains an unsolved problem that could further divide the Union. In truth, the European project may work best when we imagine it as a Europe of regions, with the nations taking the backseat. Flamenco is a dance of contrasts meant to express despair and rage, but also an exuberant lust for life. That would also be a good way to describe the current mood in Spain, where political emotions often boil over.
España es una amalgama de gentes con unos resultados no demasiado positivos para el país.
Los Estados-nación que se decía antes, ¿no? Bueno, parece ser que la Unión Europea y que en sí las instituciones debido a la globalización lo que han acatado es hacer que las grandes empresas acaben dictaminando.
During my travels, I've often thought maybe it really is time to found the European Union anew. Europe will have to be strong and united if it's to have any hope of tackling the challenges it faces in an uncertain world. But the continent's long history suggests that it possesses the vitality and inventiveness it's going to need.
Het mooie van Europa vind ik dus juist dat Griekenland, Kees, hebben een fout gemaakt. Maar we lossen samen op omdat we zo dicht met elkaar verbonden zijn dat we het samen moeten oplossen.
Hebben wij tegenwoordig de EU nog nodig? Waarom niet naar het oude systeem, iedereen zijn land, terug?
Omdat ik denk dat op economisch gebied dat we nooit meer kunnen concurreren met de landen als China en Amerika. En ik denk dat dat de enige reden is dat we nog in Europa bij elkaar blijven.
I am traumatized.
So many Dutchmen agree totally what happened in England.
Do you know what the stars on the European flag mean? There are precisely 12, and this number symbolizes completeness and perfection. For the ancient Greeks, the pantheon had 12 members, the people of Israel had 12 tribes, the year has 12 months, and the clock shows 12 hours. The stars, the European stars, are also arranged like the figures on a clock face. The continent today faces a crucial test. It's all or nothing. This could be the 11th hour.
The opponents of the European project never rest. On the contrary, spurred on by the momentum of the right-wing populists, they are constantly regrouping. Sometimes they're a little more radical, sometimes a little less. Back to the nation-state, back to the past. It's the wrong road for Europe.
Represented liberal democracy.
But all across the continent, there are movements aiming to highlight just how valuable the developments of the last 60 years have been. The movement Pulse of Europe is taking the European idea to the streets in 140 cities and 21 EU member countries. Their message? Reform Europe, rethink its structures, challenge its conventions, but don't destroy it. Europe is waking up. A new generation that grew up in a continent without borders is now fighting for that continent's future.
I'm a European in Paris, and I'm proud of Europe. It allowed me to live in this country easily, and I just want to fly the flag of Europe.
For me, there is really no real argument to say we want to go back to the nation of independent states.
In Europe, we need each other, and yes, it's also important to realize that you have both a European nationality, but also your home nationality of your country. But more and more, we're working together. We're taking flights all over Europe. We work across borders, so there's definitely an element. We want to keep on doing that.
There's an immense, cumulative, historical momentum to the Union's evolution.
Growing numbers of young Europeans are willing to take a stand in support of a diverse Europe and against the rise of nationalist populism. They've realized what's at stake and what Europe at its core is really about. The Enlightenment, the rule of law, democracy, human rights, free enterprise, education, and social security. So far, so good. But Europe will also need to change in order to renew itself. That much has been clear for some time. In other areas of the world, they speak of Europe as an enormous museum.
And it's true that Europe has not come even close to exhausting its potential for self-revitalization. This continent could have a brilliant future if Europeans are willing to make that happen. My journey through Europe has come to an end. Throughout its long history, this fascinating continent has always demonstrated an irrepressible will to change. And today that shows no sign of slackening. I'll be back.